The first frost had already claimed the garden by the time Elena Cross understood she was losing the farm. She stood at the kitchen window that October morning, watching the white breath of the prairie settle over the stunted rows of cabbages she had planted in May, hoping against hope for a harvest that would pay down the debt. The cabbages had not grown. Neither had the squash, nor the few beans she had coaxed from the rocky soil along the creek. The earth here was tired, the settlers said, and Elena had no husband to break new ground, no brothers to dig the wells, no one but her own 2 hands and a grandmother's memory that was fading even as she clung to it. She was 25 years old, alone on 40 acres of Kansas bottomland, 2 miles east of the rail spur that served the scattered settlement of Indian Creek. And the arithmetic she did every night by the lamplight whispered the same number. She had perhaps until spring, perhaps less, before Pruitt's General Store refused her another sack of flour and the bank took the deed. She did not cry. She had not cried since the funeral 3 years before, when her grandmother, the last of the Cross women, had been lowered into the ground beside the windbreak of Osage orange trees. The old woman had raised Elena from infancy, taught her to milk a cow and mend a fence and read the sky for weather, and had left her, in the end, with the farm and a debt, and a single piece of wisdom that Elena had not yet learned to use. "Folks judge a thing by its covering," her grandmother had said, her voice thin as winter light. "But a thing's worth shows only in what it does. Don't you forget that, child." Then she had closed her eyes, and Elena had been left alone with the words and the wind. Welcome to Frontier Secrets. I am your narrator, Elias Vance. Here, we unearth the forgotten stories of the American frontier. The women who built farms from nothing, the underdogs who defied the laughter of their neighbors, the quiet heroes whose names never made the history books. Elena Cross was one of those women, and her story begins in the lean months before the miracle, when hope had grown thin as the winter grass, and the only thing she owned outright was a steadily shrinking tin of savings. The farm had been in the Cross family for 3 generations, but by Elena's time it was a skeleton of what it had once been. The barn roof sagged in the middle. The chicken coop had lost its door hinge and was held shut with a loop of baling wire. The single Jersey cow, a patient old creature named Daisy, gave barely enough milk to keep Elena in butter and buttermilk through the week. 12 ordinary hens scratched in the dirt of the yard, laying small eggs that Pruitt bought at 8 cents a dozen when he bought them at all. The debt at his store hovered around $40, a sum that swelled with every bag of grain and every yard of calico she marked in the ledger. Elena rose before dawn every day, fed the stock, hauled water from the creek, mended what she could, and went to bed with the sun. And still the numbers refused to balance. The only meat she ate was the occasional rabbit she trapped in the garden. The only warmth she allowed herself was the fire she kept burning with wood she split herself. She was proud, and she was stubborn, and she was slowly, methodically starving. The neighbors were kind in their fashion. Mrs. Gardner, whose farm lay a mile to the east, brought a loaf of bread every Thursday and stayed long enough to remind Elena that a young woman alone could not run a farm. Mr. Hargrove, who owned the big spread to the west and had been buying up failed homesteads for a decade, stopped by twice that autumn to offer a fair price for the land. "You could go to Topeka," he said, his voice smooth as butter. "Find work with a respectable family. This place will kill you, Miss Cross, and there's no shame in admitting it." Elena listened to him each time and nodded and said she would think on it, and then she went back to the arithmetic that always ended in the same cold sum. It was Pruitt who told her about the auction. He was a lean man with a habit of tapping his pencil against the counter while he talked, and he had taken a quiet interest in Elena's struggle, not out of charity, but out of the merchant's knowing that a woman who paid down her debt was worth keeping as a customer. "Cattle and fowl and sundry," he said, sliding a handbill across the counter. "Down at the livestock yard Saturday. Might be you could pick up a good laying hen cheap. Your flock's getting thin, and that debt won't pay itself." Elena looked at the handbill. The printing was crooked, the ink smudged, but the words were clear. She had $11 saved in a tin hidden behind the flour bin. It was not enough to fix the roof or buy a cow or pay off even half the debt, but it was enough perhaps to buy a chance. She pinned on her good bonnet and walked the 2 miles to the auction yard with the $11 heavy in her pocket and the memory of her grandmother's voice stirring in the back of her mind. The yard was crowded with men in dusty hats and women in faded aprons, all of them eyeing the pens of hogs and sheep and a few sorry-looking horses. Elena kept to the edge of the crowd, moving toward the far pen where a traveling breeder had set up a small exhibition of fowl. She had heard of him. He passed through every few years with strange birds from overseas, and the local farmers usually laughed at his prices and went back to their Rhode Island Reds. But today his prices were not high. He stood beside a pen of the largest hens Elena had ever seen, their bodies broad as washtubs, their legs thick and yellow, their heads set with small, unbothered eyes. 37 of them, standing calm as stone in the mud of the yard, watching the crowd with what seemed like patience. "Continental Cross," the breeder said to no one in particular. "Good layers, hardy as mules, but nobody wants them. Too big, too ugly, eat too much." He laughed, but the laugh was tired. "I'd let them go cheap just to be rid of the feed bill. $10 for the lot, and I'll throw in the eggs they've laid this morning." The men around the pen laughed. One of them, a farmer named Olson, nudged his neighbor. $10 for a flock of monsters? I'd pay $10 to have them hauled off my land. What would a woman do with birds that size? Can't even fit them in a stew pot." The laughter swelled, and Elena felt the sting of it land on her shoulders, though no one had spoken to her directly. She had been the object of that kind of laughter before. The girl living alone on the failing farm, the one who talked to her cow and read old books by lamplight. It did not hurt less for being familiar. But she did not turn away. She stepped closer to the pen and looked at the great calm birds. One of them, a rooster with a comb like a crown, tilted its head and regarded her with an expression that seemed almost knowing. The breeder came over, wiping his hands on his apron. "Interested, miss? I ain't joking about the price. $10 and they're yours. They lay eggs twice the size of anything you've seen. I'll show you." He pulled an egg from his coat pocket and set it in her palm. It was enormous, nearly as large as her fist, the shell faintly speckled and warm from his pocket. Elena turned it over in her hand, feeling the weight of it, the solidity. "They lay like that?" she asked. "Like that. Through cold that'd kill a leghorn. On half the feed of a regular hen if you let them forage. They're smart, too, don't spook at hawks, don't roost in trees. Only problem is they look like something out of a fever dream, and farmers are a superstitious lot." He shrugged. "So I'm stuck with them." Elena looked at the egg again. She had been doing arithmetic in her head for months, and the arithmetic now was simple. $11 in the tin, $10 for the birds, $1 left for feed until something came. If the eggs really were that big, she could sell them for double what the ordinary hens fetched. 40 similar eggs a day would pay off the debt in months. But if the birds proved worthless, if they sickened, if the egg was a fluke, if the town laughed so hard no one would buy, she would have thrown away her last chance. She would lose the farm, and everyone who had warned her would be right. She thought of her grandmother. A thing's worth shows only in what it does. She had been looking at what the birds looked like all morning. Ugly, monstrous, a fool's folly. But she had not yet seen what they could do. She had not given them the chance. "I'll take them," she said, and the words came out before she could stop them. The breeder's eyebrows went up. "All 37? "Yes." She counted the coins into his hand, 10 silver dollars gleaming in the pale October light. The men around the pen fell silent, watching her as if she had just purchased a circus. Olson laughed again, louder this time. "Miss Cross has lost her mind. She'll be feeding those beasts through the winter with her own shoe leather." Elena did not answer. She borrowed a wagon from Pruitt, who looked at her as if she were a child who had spent her allowance on candy, and made 2 trips to haul the birds home. The monstrous hens rode placidly in the bed, blinking at the passing fields, while men along the road stopped to stare and point. Elena sat straight on the buckboard and kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, her hands tight on the reins, her heart thrumming with a mixture of terror and something that might, if she let it, be hope. If these forgotten stories of the frontier speak to your heart, subscribe to Frontier Secrets and stay by the fire a little longer. By the time she had settled the birds into the coop, Night had fallen, and the farm felt smaller and stranger than it had that morning. The monstrous hens filled the coop to bursting. Their soft murmuring and the rustle of their feathers were louder than any sound the old flock had made. Elena stood in the yard listening to them and wondered if she had made the worst mistake of her life. She built the first egg the next morning, a single speckled egg lying in the straw like a prize. And she held it in both hands and felt the weight of it, and the weight of it was the weight of a new beginning. She cracked it into a skillet, and the yolk was orange and proud, and one egg fried with a heel of bread made a meal that left her full for the first time in weeks. The boy appeared on the third morning. He was perhaps 10, thin and freckled, with the same hungry look Elena recognized from her own reflection. He was Mrs. Gardner's grandson, Sam, and he had come to fetch eggs for his grandmother's baking. But when he saw the monstrous hens, he stopped in his tracks, his mouth falling open. "Are they dangerous?" he whispered. "No," Elena said, "just big." "Can I help?" He asked it with a hope that made her chest ache. She handed him a pail of feed, and he scattered it slowly, and the great birds gathered around him without fear, and he laughed, and something in Elena eased. The eggs came faster than she had dared to hope. By the end of the first week, 20 of the hens were laying. By the end of the second, 30 were producing, and each egg was nearly twice the size of any egg in the settlement. Elena sold the first basket to Pruitt for 12 cents a dozen, and the men at the Cracker Barrel stared at the eggs in silence. Olson, who had laughed loudest, picked one up and weighed it in his hand, and the laughter died on his lips. "That's a hen's egg," he said. "It is," Elena said. "I'll take 2 dozen," said a woman from the schoolteacher's wife, and the order broke the dam. Elena sold out in an hour. She walked home with a pocket full of coins and the first real hope she had felt in years. But the laughter did not die entirely. Hargrove, whose offer to buy the land she had refused, began to whisper that the eggs could not be wholesome, that such large birds must have something wrong with them, that a body who ate those eggs was taking a risk. The whispers spread, and some of the customers who had bought at Pruitt's store stopped coming. Elena watched the numbers in her ledger begin to slip back the wrong direction, and the old cold dread crept into her stomach. She was winning, and she was losing, and the winter was still ahead. The failed harvest settled over Indian Creek like a sickness. The spring rains had come too late, the summer heat had come too early, and by October the wheat was thin, and the corn had dried in the field before it could ear. The granaries were barely a third full, and the price of flour climbed past what anyone could pay. Pruitt's shelves emptied. The hunger began in November, not the sharp hunger of a missed meal, but the slow, grinding hunger that wears a family down like a grindstone. And the monstrous hens, which everyone had laughed at, became the only steady source of food for miles. From the gate of Elena's farm, a line began to form. Neighbors who had never spoken to her came with baskets and coins, begging for eggs. The widow Dunmore, too proud to beg, stood at the back of the line with her shawl pulled tight. And Elena saw the same desolation she had felt herself a year ago. She wanted to feed them all, but the arithmetic was merciless. 40 families, 40 hens at best, and the eggs had to last through the winter. If she sold to everyone who asked, the flock would be exhausted by January. If she gave them away, there would be nothing to buy feed for the birds themselves. Hargrove saw his chance. He came to the farm one afternoon, all false sympathy, and offered to buy the entire flock for a price that would have set Elena up in Topeka for years. "Let me take the burden off your hands," he said. "You're a woman alone. This is too much weight for you." Elena looked at him, and she remembered the laughter at the auction, the whispers about the eggs, the way he had worked the town against her. She thought of her grandmother's words, and she knew that what Hargrove would do with the birds was hoard them, sell them at prices the poor could not pay, and let the widows and the schoolteachers' children starve while he grew rich. "No," she said. Hargrove's face hardened. "You're a fool, Cross, same as when you bought those monsters, only now you're a fool with other people's lives on your hands. Come spring, they'll remember who held the food and didn't share." He left her with that, and the words sank into her like frost. That night, Elena sat alone in her kitchen, the ledger open in front of her, the numbers blurring into a wall she could not climb. She had done the impossible. She had saved the farm, grown the flock, proved the mockers wrong. But she had never faced a crisis that demanded she be more than one woman. She rose before dawn the next morning with a plan that had come to her in the dark, a plan so simple and so strange that she almost laughed. She walked to Pruitt's store before the line formed at her gate, and she told him what she intended. Pruitt listened, tapping his pencil, and then he nodded. "It might work," he said. "It's the only thing I've heard that might." She called the meeting in the church that evening, and she stood before the assembled families of Indian Creek, her hands trembling, her voice steady, and she laid out the plan. The flock would be owned by shares. Every family that contributed labor or feed would receive a fair portion of eggs, and the surplus would be sold up the rail line to Topeka, where folks still had money, and the proceeds would buy flour for all. "It only works," she said, "if we do it together. One woman alone cannot feed a town. But 40 families feeding one flock, that is a thing that cannot fail." She saw the faces in the lantern light, the skeptics, the hungry, the proud, the desperate. She saw Olson, who had mocked her, and the widow Dunmore, who had not spoken to her in weeks. And she saw Hargrove standing at the back, his arms crossed, his eyes narrow. The first word came from Mrs. Gardner. "I'll give my Tuesdays and the boys' afternoons," she said, "and I'll draw my number same as any." Others nodded. The schoolteacher stepped forward. The widow Dunmore stepped forward. The line began to form, not at Elena's gate, but at the table where Pruitt opened a fresh page in his ledger and began to write. Hargrove left the church without a word. The flock grew through the winter. The eggs came every day, and the line at Elena's gate became a gathering of neighbors who worked together, laughed together, and learned the names of the monstrous hens, Goliath and Pudding and Captain and Lady Wednesday, named by Sam, who had become the unofficial keeper of the flock. Elena stood at the fence one December morning, the sky pale and enormous over the frozen Kansas land, and she watched Sam scatter feed to the great birds. The boy had grown sturdy over the season, his face filled out, his hands quick and sure. He looked up and grinned at her. "They like me," he said. "They like anyone who feeds them," Elena said, but she was smiling. The single egg she had found the morning after the auction still sat on the windowsill, a reminder of the risk she had taken, the day she had spent her last dollar on a flock of monsters. But now the window looked out not on a failing farm, but on a settlement that had learned to work together, on a flock that fed 40 families, on a boy who had found his purpose in the shadow of the largest chickens in Kansas. Her grandmother had been right. A thing's worth shows only in what it does. And the thing Elena Cross had done, buying the monstrous birds, enduring the laughter, holding the line against the greed of a powerful man, had shown a worth that would echo through the settlement for generations. The wind came off the plains, carrying the first flakes of the winter's worst storm, and Elena pulled her shawl tighter. The storm would be hard, but the flock was sheltered, the coop was sound, and the grain in the storehouse would see them through. She had not won by being stronger or richer or smarter than anyone else. She had won by looking at what a thing could do, and by trusting that the doing would outlast the laughter. She walked back inside the warm kitchen, where the fire crackled and the kettle steamed, and she began to gather the eggs for the morning count. The great speckled eggs filled the basket, one after another, and the weight of them was the weight of a whole town's hope. This is Elias Vance, and you have been listening to Frontier Secrets. Subscribe and step back in time. The frontier hides more than it shows. Spring came late to Indian Creek that year, and when it arrived all at once, melting the snow in a single week of warm rain and turning the roads to mud that sucked at wagon wheels and boots alike. Elena Cross stood at her kitchen door on the first truly warm morning of April, watching the water drip from the eaves, and she felt the weight of the winter lift from her shoulders like a blanket she had been carrying too long. The share system had worked better than she had dared to hope. The 40 families had held together through the coldest months, drawing their fair portions of eggs, sending their children to help with the foraging. And the flock had not only survived, but grown. 57 birds now filled the coop and the yard, and the surplus eggs that Pruitt sold up the line to Topeka had bought enough flour and feed to carry everyone through to the planting season. The debt at the store was gone. The deed to the farm was safe. Elena had money in the tin again, a small hoard of silver coins she kept wrapped in a cloth, and she allowed herself, for the first time in years, to believe that the hard part was behind her. It was not. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a letter, delivered by a boy on a lathered horse from the county seat. It was addressed to Elena Cross, and it bore the official seal of the Agricultural Board. Mrs. Gardner brought it over from the post office, her face tight with concern, and she stood in Elena's kitchen while Elena read it aloud by the lamplight. The letter said that a complaint had been filed against the Cross farm, alleging that the continental cross fowl housed there posed a risk of disease transmission to other livestock in the settlement. An inspector would be arriving within the week to examine the flock and the premises. If the complaint was substantiated, the board would order the destruction of all birds on the property. Elena's hands trembled as she set the letter down. "Who filed the complaint?" Mrs. Gardner shook her head. "Anonymous. But there's only one man in this county who would go that far." She did not say Hargrove's name, but the word hung in the air between them, heavy as an iron weight. Elena looked out the window at the yard where the great hens were scratching in the new grass, their feathers gleaming in the April sun. They looked healthy, strong, absurdly content. She had watched them through the winter, had seen them shrug off the cold and the damp that would have killed any ordinary hen. She had nursed a few cases of bumblefoot and one egg-bound hen named Biscuit, but nothing that could be called an epidemic. The accusation was a lie, and she knew it. And she also knew that the lie did not have to be true to do damage. The news traveled through the settlement faster than the inspector could. By the time the official arrived, a lean man named Dr. Barnaby, with spectacles and a notebook and a manner that suggested he had seen every kind of rural fraud, the mood at the farm had shifted. Some of the families who had been part of the share system began to hang back, hesitant to send their children to the coop. The widow Dunmore stopped coming entirely. Olson, who had been quiet since the winter, was suddenly loud again, standing at Pruitt's store and telling anyone who would listen that he had warned them all about the monster birds. "You can't trust something that looks like that," he said, jabbing a finger toward the window. "Cross's farm was already failing when she bought them. You think a flock of freaks turned it around? Something's wrong there, and the county knows it." Elena heard the echo of his words when she walked into the store that afternoon. The conversation stopped when she entered, and the silence was worse than the laughter had been. She bought her supplies quickly, paid with her silver coins, and left without meeting anyone's eyes. Back at the farm, she found Sam sitting on the fence, his chin on his knees, his face drawn. "Grandma says I shouldn't come anymore," he said, not looking at her. "She says it ain't safe till the inspector says so." Elena sat down beside him on the weathered rail. "Sam, your grandmother is scared. People are scared. But the birds are healthy. They have always been healthy." "I know," Sam said, and his voice cracked. "But what if the inspector says they're not? What happens then?" Elena had no answer. She put her hand on his shoulder, and they sat together in the spring sunlight, watching the great hens peck and preen, and she felt the old cold dread creeping back into her chest. Dr. Barnaby arrived on a Wednesday morning, driving a buggy that had seen better days, his notebook already open. He was thorough. Elena had to give him that. He examined every bird, checked their combs and wattles, their droppings, their feathers. He inspected the coop, the feed bins, the water troughs. He asked Elena about her winter feed, about deaths or illnesses, about any signs of distemper. She answered every question calmly, truthfully, and she saw his skepticism begin to fade as the hours passed. By the time the sun was slanting toward the horizon, he closed his notebook and looked at her with something like respect. "Miss Cross," he said, "I have examined every animal on this property, and I find no evidence of disease, past or present. Your birds are in exceptional health. The complaint was without merit." Elena felt a rush of relief so sharp it nearly buckled her knees. "Then the flock is safe?" "The flock is safe. I will file my report with the board, and you will not hear from us again on this matter." He paused, and his voice softened. "You have my apologies for the distress this has caused. I know how these things can harm a farm's reputation." He left that evening, and Elena walked into the yard and stood among her birds, the great peaceful creatures that had saved her, and that she was now charged to save in turn. She thought the crisis was over. The share system would resume. The families would return. The lie would be buried. She was wrong. The damage had already been done. The complaint, even if proven false, had planted a seed of doubt that no report from the county could uproot. Some of the families who had pulled away did not return. The widow Dunmore, who had been the first to sign the share agreement, came to Elena a week after the inspector's visit and asked to withdraw. "It's not that I don't trust you," she said, her eyes on the ground. "It's that my neighbors are talking, and I cannot bear to be the one who brought sickness into their homes. I'm sorry." Elena let her go. She did not argue. She understood that fear was a harder enemy than any man, and that fear did not listen to reason. The share system shrank. Fewer hands came to help with the work. Fewer sacks of feed arrived at the gate. The burden began to fall back on Elena alone, and she felt the old exhaustion creeping up on her, the weight of the farm pressing down on her shoulders. Hargrove saw his moment. He came to the farm in the middle of May, when the spring planting was in full swing, and Elena was working from dawn until dark, trying to do the work of 3 people. He stood at the fence, his hat in his hands, and he did not even pretend to be friendly. "I heard about the inspector," he said. "You got lucky. But the people are still scared and they won't come back. You know I'm right." Elena wiped the sweat from her forehead. "What do you want?" "The same thing I've always wanted, the land and the flock. I'm willing to pay a fair price, better than I offered before, because I know you've put work into them, but I won't wait forever. The longer you hold out, the lower that price gets." He named a figure that was half of what the flock and the farm were worth. Elena felt a hot surge of anger, but she swallowed it. "No," she said. Hargrove's smile did not waver. "You'll change your mind. They always do." He tipped his hat and walked away, and Elena stood at the fence watching him go, and she knew that he was not done. He had only begun. The summer was a slow poison. The families who remained in the share system were the faithful few: Mrs. Gardner, the schoolteacher, the Lawrence cousins, a handful of others, and they worked hard. But the flock had grown to nearly 70 birds, and the work of feeding and watering and cleaning and gathering was more than a handful of people could manage. Elena began to take on the extra shifts herself. She woke earlier, went to bed later, and her hands, already rough, grew calloused and cracked. She ate standing up, slept in her clothes, and the arithmetic she did at night was no longer the hopeful calculation of the winter, but a desperate tally of what she could afford to lose. And then the rumors started again. This time, it was not about disease. It was about Elena herself. Hargrove had found a new angle, and he worked it through the store and the church and the women's sewing circle. He whispered that Elena Cross was not the innocent victim she appeared to be. He whispered that she had purchased the monstrous birds with money that came from somewhere suspicious, that she had a secret benefactor, or that the debt at Pruitt's store had never been real, or that the whole story of the auction was a fabrication designed to make her look like a struggling homesteader when really she was something else entirely. He did not say what that something else was. He left the shape of it to the imagination, and the imagination filled it with shadows. The rumors spread like fire through dry grass. Suddenly, Elena was not the woman who had saved the settlement through the hungry winter. She was the woman who had fooled everyone, who had tricked them into depending on her, who was probably laughing at them from her farm while they brought her their labor and their feed. Olson, always eager to believe the worst, became the rumor-monger's chief messenger. He was at the store every afternoon, repeating the same phrases, and every time he spoke, another family pulled away. By August, only 6 families remained in the share system. The flock was producing more eggs than those 6 could use, and the surplus was piling up faster than Pruitt could sell it. The price had dropped because the story had spread up the rail line to Topeka, and buyers were wary. Elena found herself with full baskets and empty pockets, the silver tin dwindling, and the old familiar panic rising in her throat. She called a meeting in the church again, as she had that November, but the church was half empty. The ones who came were the faithful: Gardner, the schoolteacher, the Lawrence cousins, a few others. They sat in the wooden pews, their faces tired, and they listened to Elena explain that the flock was healthy, that the rumors were lies, that she had never deceived anyone. She saw the doubt in their eyes, not because they disbelieved her, but because they were tired of fighting. They had fought through the winter, and now they faced a summer of whispers, and they did not know how much more they could bear. "I will not give in to Hargrove," Elena said, her voice steady, though her hands were shaking. "The flock is the only thing that kept this settlement alive in December. It can keep us alive again, if we hold together. But we have to hold." Mrs. Gardner stood up. "I'll hold," she said. "I'll hold until the last hen dies." The others murmured agreement, but the sound was thin, and Elena felt the weight of the empty pews behind her. She walked home that night under a sky thick with clouds, and she knew that the storm was not over. True to her fear, the storm came 3 days later, not a storm of rumors, but a real storm, a late summer tempest that rolled in from the west with a fury that took everyone by surprise. The wind hit the farm at midnight, and Elena woke to the sound of the coop roof tearing open, the frantic squawking of the monstrous hens, the rain lashing against her windows like 1,000 whips. She pulled on her coat and ran out into the dark, the wind pushing her sideways, the rain blinding her, and she reached the coop to find the roof half gone, the birds huddled in terror, and the walls beginning to buckle. She worked through the night, dragging the hens one by one into the barn, her hands numb with cold, her voice hoarse from shouting. Sam arrived at some point, his small frame fighting the wind, and together they carried the birds to safety. By dawn, the storm had passed, but the coop was destroyed. The yard was a sea of mud, and a dozen of the best layers were missing, blown away by the wind, or drowned, or lost in the dark. Elena stood in the wreckage, her coat soaked, her body trembling with exhaustion, and she counted the survivors. 42 birds remained. The work of a year had been undone in a single night. She sat down in the mud and wept. Sam crouched beside her, saying nothing, and after a long moment, he put his hand on her arm. "We can rebuild," he said. Elena looked at the ruined coop, the missing birds, the empty feed bins, and the line of families who would not return. She thought of Hargrove's face, his knowing smile, the way he had predicted exactly this. She thought of the silver tin, nearly empty. She thought of the debt, creeping back toward her like a shadow. "Yes," she said, but her voice was hollow. "We can rebuild." The sun rose over the wreckage, and the great hens began to emerge from the barn, shaking their feathers, looking absurdly calm in the morning light. One of them, the rooster named Goliath, strode over to Elena and pecked at her boot, as if telling her to get up, to keep going. She did not know if she had the strength. But the line at the gate was already forming, not the line of families hoping to buy eggs, but the line of the faithful. Mrs. Gardner with her hammer, the schoolteacher with a bundle of lumber, the Lawrence cousins with buckets of nails, and Sam still standing beside her, mud-stained and determined. They would rebuild, and they would fight, and Hargrove would not win. But as Elena looked at the faces of her neighbors, she knew that the battle was not over. It had only just begun. The rebuilding took 2 weeks, and by the end of it, Elena Cross had aged more than she had in the entire winter. Her hands were wrapped in strips of cloth where the blisters had broken, and healed and broken again, and her back ached with a dull, persistent fire that did not fade even when she lay down at night. The new coop was smaller than the old one, built from salvaged lumber and the leftover shingles from the barn roof, but it was sound and dry, and the 42 remaining birds settled into it with the same placid acceptance they showed to everything. Goliath, the great crowned rooster, had taken to standing on the roof of the new coop at sunrise, his comb catching the first light, and he crowed with a voice that seemed too large for his body. Elena took it as a good sign, a small defiance against the wreckage. But the wreckage was not only physical. The share system, which had carried the settlement through the winter, was now a skeleton of its former self. Of the 40 families who had signed the ledger at Pruitt's store, only 6 remained: Mrs. Gardner and Sam, the schoolteacher Mr. Albright, the Lawrence cousins, the widow Dunmore who had returned after the inspector's report, and a shy farming couple named the Pettigrews, who had never spoken much but had quietly shown up every day with a sack of feed or a bundle of kindling. 6 families could not sustain a flock of 42 birds, especially with the summer heat driving down the hens' laying and the prices at Pruitt's store dropping as the rumors spread up the rail line. Elena did the arithmetic every night, and every night the numbers told the same story. She was losing ground. Hargrove did not need to act directly. The damage was already being done by the wind and the drought and the fear he had planted. A dry spell settled over Indian Creek in late August, the kind of dry spell that turned the creek to a trickle and the pasture to dust. The monstrous hens, which had foraged so well in the spring, now found little in the parched fields. Elena had to buy more feed to supplement them, and the feed from Pruitt's store cost more than the eggs she was selling. The silver tin emptied. The old debt at the store had been paid off, but a new one began to grow, smaller than before, but growing nonetheless, and Pruitt's face grew longer each time she came to the counter. "I don't want to cut you off, Miss Cross," he said one afternoon, tapping his pencil against the ledger. "But I have to eat too." Elena nodded. She understood. She had always understood that the world did not owe her mercy. Olson had become Hargrove's loudest voice. He was at the store every afternoon, repeating the latest rumor with the satisfaction of a man who enjoyed being the bearer of bad news. "I heard the county's going to take those birds," he announced to the Cracker Barrel crowd. "Heard they got some disease that ain't shown up yet. Just a matter of time. Cross is going to lose everything, and she's dragging the faithful down with her." Mrs. Gardner was in the store that day, buying salt, and she heard the remark. She said nothing to Olson, but later that evening she came to Elena's farm with a drawn face and a piece of news that made Elena's stomach drop. "There's a meeting called at the church tomorrow evening," Mrs. Gardner said. "Hargrove is organizing it. He's saying that your flock is using more water than the whole rest of the settlement combined, and that with the creek running low, something has to be done." Elena stared at her. "The birds drink water, same as any animal, but not more than a dozen cows would." "I know that. You know that. But Hargrove is telling it different. He's saying your birds are unnatural, that they don't belong here, that they're a drain on resources that could go to families." Mrs. Gardner's voice was tight. "And people are listening. They're scared of the drought. They're scared of losing what little they have. And Hargrove is giving them someone to blame." Elena felt the old familiar weight pressing down on her chest. She had faced the auction, the winter, the inspector, the storm. But this was different. This was not a lie she could disprove, or a storm she could rebuild from. This was the slow, patient erosion of trust, the turning of neighbors against one another, the manufacture of a scapegoat. And she was the scapegoat. "I'll come to the meeting," she said. Mrs. Gardner shook her head. "He doesn't want you there. He's making it a town meeting, but he's not inviting you." "Then I'll come anyway." The church was full when Elena arrived the next evening. She walked through the door with Sam at her side, and the room fell silent. Hargrove was standing at the front, beside the pulpit, a piece of paper in his hand. He did not look surprised to see her. "Miss Cross," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "I didn't expect you to attend, but perhaps it's better that you hear this directly." He read from the paper. It was a petition, signed by 33 families in the settlement, requesting that the continental crossfowl be removed from the common grazing land and confined to Elena's property in a manner that would prevent them from accessing the creek. The petition claimed that the birds were consuming water needed for human use and threatening the health of other livestock. It was not a demand to destroy the flock, not yet, but it was a first step, a legal boundary drawn in the dust. "We are not your enemies, Miss Cross," Hargrove said, folding the paper with a careful, deliberate motion. "We are your neighbors, and we are simply asking that you consider the common good." Elena looked at the faces in the pews. Some of them were the faithful, Mrs. Gardner, the Lawrence cousins, the schoolteacher. Their eyes were fixed on her with a mixture of hope and despair. But most of the faces were those who had signed the petition, people she had fed through the winter, people whose children had eaten her eggs, people who had laughed at her birds and then come begging and then turned away again. She saw the widow Dunmore, who had returned to the share system, and had now signed the petition. She saw Olsen, smirking. She saw the fear in every face, the fear of drought, of hunger, of the unknown. And she knew that arguing would do no good. Hargrove had already won this battle. The petition was not about water, it was about control, and he had used the drought to draw a line between her and the town. The ones who signed had chosen their side. "Very well," Elena said, and her voice was steady, though her hands were cold. "I will keep the birds on my property. They will not use the creek. I will haul water for them myself." Hargrove's smile widened. He had expected her to fight, and her compliance made her look weak. "That is very reasonable of you, Miss Cross. I am sure the board will appreciate your cooperation." Someone in the back laughed, a low, ugly sound. Elena turned and walked out of the church, and the door closed behind her, and the murmuring began. The drought worsened through September. The creek shrank to a muddy ribbon, then to a line of damp stones, then to nothing. The wells in the settlement began to run low, and the price of water rose, if water could be priced by a man with a deep well. Hargrove had the deepest well on his spread, and he began selling water to his neighbors at a rate that kept them just barely alive and just barely in his debt. Elena hauled water from a spring 2 miles north, carrying 2 buckets at a time, making 4 trips a day, and her arms and shoulders burned with the strain. The monstrous hens had to be watered by hand now, and they looked at her with their small, calm eyes as if to ask why the world had become so difficult. The faithful 6 did what they could. Sam helped with the hauling, his thin arms straining under the weight of a bucket each morning. Mrs. Gardner brought food when she had it. The Lawrence cousins came by with a wagon and helped carry a barrel of water from the spring, which saved Elena 2 days of labor. But the share system could not function without water for the birds, and the birds could not lay without water, and the eggs that had once been the settlement's lifeline were now a trickle. Pruitt's orders from Topeka dried up, the feed bill grew, and Elena watched the number of birds declining, not from disease, but from the sheer impossibility of supporting them alone. By October, she had 34 hens. She was in the coop one evening, talking to Goliath in a low voice, when Sam appeared at the door. He had grown taller over the summer, and his face had lost some of its boyish roundness. He looked at Elena with an expression she had not seen before, something hard and knowing. "Grandma says I shouldn't come anymore," he said. Elena felt the words land like a blow to the chest. "Why?" "Because people are talking. They say if I keep coming here, they'll think Grandma is part of your scheme. They'll turn against her too." His voice was flat, as if he were reciting a lesson. "She doesn't want that. She's already losing customers for her baking." Elena wanted to tell him that there was no scheme, that the birds were innocent, that Hargrove was the one who had poisoned the well. But she saw the truth in Sam's eyes. He was being pulled away, not by his own will, but by the same fear that had pulled everyone else. She could not ask him to stay. It would not be fair. "Your grandmother is right," she said, and the words tasted like ash. "You should go. You have your own life to live." Sam did not move. He stood in the doorway of the coop, the golden light of the setting sun falling across his face, and for a long moment he looked at Goliath, who was preening on his perch. "I named him," Sam said quietly, "Goliath, because he was the biggest. I remember. He's not a monster, he's just a rooster." "I know." Sam nodded, and then he turned and walked away, and Elena watched him go, and the coop felt empty and cold, and the weight of the silence pressed down on her like the whole sky. The weeks that followed were the loneliest of Elena's life. She woke before dawn, fed the birds, hauled water from the spring, cleaned the coop, collected the eggs, and sold what she could to Pruitt at a price that barely covered the feed. She ate standing up, slept in her clothes, and the house began to feel like a shell she inhabited rather than a home. The faith of her grandmother, the words that had carried her through the auction and the winter, began to seem distant, like a story she had heard about someone else. One evening she sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open, the numbers blurring before her eyes, and she realized that she had not cried in weeks. She had been too tired for tears. The arithmetic had reached a point where it no longer even threatened ruin. It simply confirmed what she already knew. She would lose the farm by spring. The flock would be sold or slaughtered. She would have nothing, and she would go to Topeka or to somewhere, and she would be another failed homesteader, another woman who could not make it alone. She closed the ledger and blew out the lamp, and she sat in the dark, listening to the wind. A knock came at the door. Elena did not move. She had no energy for visitors. But the knock came again, insistent, and she rose and opened the door to find Mrs. Gardner standing on the porch, a lantern in her hand, her face tight with urgency. "Elena," Mrs. Gardner said, "something has happened. You need to come." "What is it?" "The Lawrence cousins' place. Their well has gone completely dry. They have no water, and the baby is sick with fever. The nearest well with water is Hargrove's, and he's charging $1 a barrel. They don't have $1. Elena stared at her. "The spring I use is 2 miles north. It's still flowing, though the water's low." "I know, but they can't carry water that far, not with the baby sick." "I was hoping," Mrs. Gardner hesitated, "I was hoping you might have a plan. You always do." Elena thought of the ledger, the debt, the dwindling flock, the empty silver tin. She had nothing left. But she looked at Mrs. Gardner's face, and she saw the same desperation she had seen in November, the same hunger, the same fear. And she realized that even if she could not save herself, she could still try to save someone else. She found 2 barrels in the barn and hitched Daisy the cow to the wagon. The old Jersey was slow and stubborn, but she could pull a load. Elena drove through the dark, the lantern swinging from the wagon seat, and she reached the spring at midnight, the water cold and clear in the moonlight. She filled both barrels, her arms aching, her breath fogging in the cold air, and then she drove the 2 miles to the Lawrence cousins' farm and helped them carry water into the house. She stayed until the baby's fever broke, and by then it was dawn, and she had not slept, and the world had a hollow ringing sound. But something had shifted in her chest, a small spark that had not been there before. She had done something that was not for herself, and it had mattered, and that mattered to her. The Lawrence cousins wept with gratitude. They had signed the petition, they admitted, because they had been afraid. But now they saw what Elena was, a woman who gave water to a family that had turned against her, who hauled barrels through the night for a baby that was not her own. They asked to return to the share system. Elena looked at them, and she saw that the faithfulness of a few, however small, could still grow. She did not know if it would be enough, but she said yes. And as she drove home in the gray light of the October morning, the milk cow plodding slowly, the empty barrels rattling in the wagon bed, she heard her grandmother's voice on the wind, as clear as if she were sitting beside her. "A thing's worth shows only in what it does." She did not know how much longer she could hold, but she knew that she would hold, if only to see what the doing would show. The Lawrence cousins returned to the share system with a quiet humility that touched something deep in Elena Cross. They came to the farm the morning after the water haul. The father, a thin man named Jeremiah Lawrence, standing at the gate with his hat in his hands, and his wife beside him, their baby wrapped in a shawl, sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. Jeremiah did not make excuses. He did not explain why he had signed the petition. He simply looked at Elena and said, "We were wrong. We should not have turned away. If you'll have us back, we'll work twice as hard to make up for it." Elena looked at the sleeping baby, at the mother's tired face, at the father's bent shoulders. She thought of the night she had spent hauling water, the cold ache in her arms, the way the spring had glittered in the moonlight like a promise she had not known she was keeping. "You are welcome," she said, and she meant it. The share system now numbered 7 families. It was not 40. It was not enough to carry the flock through the winter on labor alone, but it was enough to feel like a beginning. The Lawrence cousins brought a hand pump from their old well, which Elena installed near the coop. And though the pump drew only a trickle, it was better than hauling every bucket from the spring. Sam returned too, slipping through the fence on the 3rd morning after the meeting at the church, a pail in his hand and a look of defiance on his young face. His grandmother had not stopped him, and he had come to feed the birds he had named. "Goliath missed you," Elena said, and Sam smiled, and the world felt a little less heavy. But the drought did not break. October crawled into November, and the sky remained a hard, cloudless blue. The sun rose pale and set red, and the wind carried the smell of dry earth and desperation. Hargrove's water sales became the settlement's only source, and his prices climbed as the wells of his neighbors went dry one by one. The faithful seven could not afford to buy from him. They relied on the spring, and on the hand pump, and on the dwindling supplies they had stored. And every day the arithmetic grew more desperate. Pruitt's store shelves were nearly bare now. The shipments from Topeka had slowed to a trickle, because the drought had affected the whole region, and the railroads were prioritizing grain for the cities. The flour that remained cost twice what it had in the spring. The feed for the monstrous hens had become a luxury that Elena could barely afford. She was spending nearly every penny she earned from the few eggs she sold on feed alone, and the silver tin was down to a handful of coins. If the drought lasted another month, there would be nothing left. The hens themselves began to change. Elena noticed it first in Goliath. The great rooster, who had always stood at the top of the coop roof at dawn, now spent his mornings scratching in the dry yard, his comb slightly pale, his movements slower. The hens were laying fewer eggs, and the eggs they laid were smaller, their shells thinner. Elena had seen this before in the winter, when the cold had suppressed their laying. But this was different. This was the stress of a world that would not give them what they needed. She stood in the yard one afternoon, watching the hens pick listlessly at the dust, and she felt the old familiar despair creeping back. She had rebuilt the coop, hauled the water, kept the flock alive through the inspector and the storm and the petition. But she could not make it rain. She could not make the creek flow. She could not buy feed she did not have. And the thing she had built, the share system, the hope, the fragile trust, was collapsing under the weight of the sky. The grasshoppers came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. They came not in a swarm, but in a cloud, a living wall of brown and green that blotted out the sun at midday. Elena was in the barn, mending a harness, when she heard the sound. A low, dry rustling, like 1,000 leaves scraping together, growing louder and louder until it became a roar. She stepped outside and looked up, and the sky was moving. The grasshoppers descended on Indian Creek with a fury that no one had seen in a generation. They covered the fields, the gardens, the fences, the roofs. They stripped the dying corn stalks in minutes. They devoured the dry grass until the ground was bare. They crawled through cracks in the walls, into the wells, into the stores, into the bedding. The sound of their chewing was a grinding, ceaseless horror that did not stop for 3 days. The settlement locked itself indoors. Families stuffed rags under doors and covered windows with blankets. But the grasshoppers found their way in anyway. They ate the curtains. They ate the flour in the bins. They ate the wool off the sheep, if any sheep had survived the drought. The few gardens that had clung to life were obliterated. The Lawrence cousins, who had planted a late crop of turnips in a desperate hope, watched the turnips disappear into a moving carpet of insects. And then, as suddenly as they had come, the grasshoppers left. The wind shifted, and the cloud lifted and drifted east, and the sun came out again, and Indian Creek was a wasteland. The settlement gathered in the church that evening, a meeting called not by Hargrove, but by the sheer weight of shared catastrophe. The pews were full, but the faces were different from the last meeting. There was no anger, no suspicion. There was only shock, and the dawning horror of a winter without crops, without pasture, without anything. Hargrove stood at the front, his face pale. He had been the richest man in the settlement, the one with the deepest well and the largest stores. But the grasshoppers had not spared him. They had eaten his hay, his grain, the vegetable patch his wife had tended. His cattle, already weak from the drought, stood in a barren field with nothing to eat. He spoke, and his voice was not smooth now. It was thin, frayed. "We are facing starvation," he said. "There is no other word for it. The railroad cannot bring enough food to feed us all. The stores in Topeka are running low themselves. We have perhaps a month of flour left if we ration. After that—" He did not finish the sentence. Someone in the crowd spoke. "What about the monstrous hens?" The words hung in the air, and all eyes turned to Elena. She was sitting in the back pew, her hands folded in her lap. She had not expected to be called on. She had come because she was a member of the settlement, because the disaster belonged to everyone. But she had not prepared to speak. "They're alive," she said, and her voice was quiet but carried. "The grasshoppers don't hurt them. They eat the grasshoppers. They had their fill for 3 days, and they're laying again. I have 42 hens and 1 rooster, and they are still producing." A murmur ran through the crowd. The widow Dunmore, who had signed the petition and then returned, stood up. "I saw them myself," she said. "I went to the Cross farm yesterday, and the birds were fat and happy. They ate the grasshoppers like it was a feast. The coop is covered in them, but the hens just peck them off the walls." Another voice from the back. "How many eggs are you getting, Miss Cross?" Elena did the arithmetic in her head. 30 a day, give or take. They're not as big as they were in the spring, but they're still twice the size of a regular egg. And the hens are hardy. They can survive on less than what we've been giving them. They'll eat the grasshoppers that are still in the fields, and the dry grass, and the kitchen scraps. The silence that followed was not hostile. It was the silence of people who were doing arithmetic of their own. An egg was food. A big egg could feed a child. 42 hens laying 30 eggs a day could feed a dozen families, maybe more, if they were careful, if they pooled the food, if they shared. Hargrove's face hardened. He had not expected this. He had expected the meeting to be about his water, his cattle, his remaining store of grain. He had not expected the woman he had spent a year trying to ruin to offer the only hope in the room. "The birds are not enough," he said. 30 eggs a day will not feed 40 families. "No," Elena agreed. "But 40 families working together to keep those birds alive and laying might feed more than 30 eggs a day. The flock can grow. I have eggs that can hatch. If we set the broody hens now, we could have 100 birds by spring. And the birds themselves can be eaten, if it comes to that. They are not just egg layers. They are meat. One of those hens would feed a family for a week." She had not planned to say that. The words had come out of her mouth before she had fully considered them, and she saw the shock in the faces of the faithful few who knew how much she loved the birds. But the truth was the truth. The flock was a resource, and if the settlement was to survive, every resource had to be counted. "We could rebuild the share system," Mrs. Gardner said, standing up. "We had it before. It worked through the winter. It can work again." The murmur grew louder. Some nodded. Others looked uncertain. Hargrove's voice cut through. "It cannot work if the birds are only on her farm. She controls the flock. She controls the eggs. And we have seen what happens when one person holds the food." Elena stood up now. She was trembling, but her voice was steady. "I do not want to hold the food. I wanted to share it from the beginning. I called a meeting a year ago, and 40 families signed the ledger. I did not force anyone to leave. The petition, the rumors, the inspector, those did not come from me." She looked directly at Hargrove as she said it, and for the first time she saw something flicker in his eyes. Not guilt, but recognition. The room was divided. Some families, the ones who had stuck with Elena through the summer, were already planning how to rebuild the share system. Others, the ones who had signed the petition and stayed away, were still wary. They had turned against her once. They were not sure they could trust her again. And Hargrove had not given up. He still had his well, his cattle, his influence. He would not let the monstrous hens become the salvation of the settlement without a fight. But Elena had one thing that had not been there before: the grasshoppers. The disaster that had destroyed the crops had also proven that the hens were not a liability. They were an asset. They had feasted on the plague. They had thrived where everything else had withered. And that was a fact that could not be whispered away. As the meeting broke up, the faithful 7 gathered around Elena in the churchyard under a cold November moon. Mrs. Gardner, Sam, the Lawrence cousins, the Pettigrews, the widow Dunmore, the schoolteacher, Mr. Albright. They stood close, their breath fogging in the air. "We will rebuild," Mrs. Gardner said. "We will do it again. And this time, we will not let him tear it down." Elena looked at their faces, tired and determined, and she felt something she had not felt in months. Not hope, exactly. Something quieter, a stubbornness that would not be defeated. But as she walked home that night, she knew that Hargrove was not finished. He had lost the argument tonight, but he would find another way. He always did. And the winter was coming, and the flock was still small, and the straw was still thin, and the arithmetic was still uncertain. She walked into the coop before going to bed, the lantern casting long shadows across the roosting hens. Goliath lifted his head and blinked at her, his comb bright in the warm light. She reached out and touched his feathers, and he made a soft sound, trusting, peaceful. "One day at a time," she whispered. The hens murmured in response, and the sound was like a promise. The November moon hung low and cold over Indian Creek, and Elena Cross stood at the door of the coop long after the meeting had ended, listening to the soft murmur of the hens settling for the night. The lantern light pooled around her boots, and the great birds shifted on their perches, their voices a low clucking that sounded almost like conversation. Goliath had tucked his head under his wing, and the sight of him, so calm, so utterly unconcerned with the storm of human affairs that had raged in the church, steadied her. She had 42 birds. She had 7 families who would stand with her. She had the memory of the grasshoppers falling from the sky, and the knowledge that the monstrous hens had done what no crop could do, turned a plague into a feast. She banked the lantern and walked back to the house, but she did not sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with the ledger and a fresh sheet of paper and began to write a new plan. The share system would have to be rebuilt from the ground up. This time, it would not be based on goodwill alone. It would be based on a written contract signed by every family with clear terms for contribution and distribution. She had learned that trust could be broken too easily, that the whispers of a single man could undo the work of a year. The contract would protect the flock even if the trust faltered. She wrote by the light of a single candle until her hand cramped and the sky began to lighten. Then she put on her coat and walked to Mrs. Gardner's house before the sun was fully up. Mrs. Gardner answered the door in her apron, a streak of flour on her cheek. She had been up since before dawn, baking the bread that was the last of her store of flour. She listened to Elena's plan, and then she nodded. "I'll help you draw it up," she said, "and I'll be the first to sign." They worked through the morning at Mrs. Gardner's kitchen table, the contract taking shape sentence by sentence. It was simple. Each family would contribute labor, feed, or supplies according to its means. Each would draw eggs according to a fair count recorded in a single ledger. The flock would remain on Elena's land, but ownership would be shared among all signatories. No family could sell or barter its share without the consent of the others, and if any family withdrew, its share would be redistributed. It was not a perfect document, but it was honest, and it gave everyone a stake in the outcome. By noon, the contract was ready. Elena carried it to the church, where she had asked Mrs. Gardner to call a second meeting for that evening. The word had spread about the grasshoppers and the hens, and the church was fuller than it had been the night before. Some of the families that had stayed away for months had returned, drawn by the hope that Elena's birds might be the difference between survival and starvation. Elena stood at the front, the contract in her hands, and she read it aloud. When she finished, she looked at the faces in the pews, and she chose her words carefully. "There is no fine print," she said. "There is no trick. The flock belongs to all of us, or it belongs to none of us. That is the only way this can work. If you want to sign, you are welcome. If you do not, you are still my neighbors, and I will not turn you away if you are hungry. But the protection of the flock will belong to those who share the burden." The silence stretched, and then a woman near the back stood up. It was the widow Dunmore. She walked to the front, took the pen that Mrs. Gardner offered, and signed her name with a hand that shook only slightly. Then the schoolteacher signed. Then the Lawrence cousins. Then a family Elena had never spoken to, a young couple with a baby who had lost their garden to the grasshoppers. One by one, the families came forward. By the end of the evening, 19 families had signed. It was not 40, but it was a beginning. Hargrove did not come to the meeting. He had sent word that the drought had weakened his cattle and that he could not spare the time. Elena suspected the truth was simpler. He had seen the contract as a rival, and he had chosen to ignore it rather than fight it. She did not trust his silence. A man who had spent a year trying to ruin her was not a man who would simply give up the fight. He was waiting, and she had to be ready. The rebuilding of the share system began the next morning. The 19 families brought what they had: sacks of feed, bales of straw, tools, labor. The men repaired the coop roof and reinforced the fence. The women helped with the feeding and the egg collection, and the children, led by Sam, scattered the feed and named the new chicks that had hatched from the broody hens. The flock grew slowly, 46 birds by the end of November, 51 by the first week of December. The eggs came steadily, and Pruitt, who had been skeptical of the contract, began to sell them up the line again, not at the old prices, but at prices that at least covered the cost of feed. The winter was hard, but it was not the winter of the year before. The share system spread the burden across 19 families, and though each family ate less than it would have liked, no one went hungry. Elena worked longer hours than anyone, rising before dawn and going to bed after the stars were out. But she was not alone. Sam was there every morning, his thin hands quick and sure. Mrs. Gardner came every afternoon, bringing bread or stew or news from the settlement. The Lawrence cousins brought their baby, and the baby grew fat and rosy on the rich eggs that came from the monstrous hens. But Hargrove had not forgotten. He had been quiet through November, nursing his wounded pride and the cattle that grew thinner each day on the barren pasture. In early December, he found his weapon. The new well was the talk of the settlement. A traveling well digger had passed through and offered his services to the desperate families, and Hargrove had paid him to sink a well on Elena's property without consulting her. The well digger arrived on a Tuesday with a team of horses and a derrick, and he began to drill at a spot near the coop, claiming he had been authorized by the county to provide water to the common land. Elena came running when she saw what was happening, and she found Hargrove standing beside the well digger, his arms crossed, a cold smile on his face. "Good afternoon, Miss Cross," he said. "I am providing a service to the settlement. A well on this land will benefit everyone. Surely you cannot object to that." Elena's heart was pounding. The well digger had already bored 10 feet into the earth, and the mud and water were beginning to seep. It was happening too fast to stop. "You cannot dig a well on my property without my permission," she said. "I have the county's authorization," Hargrove said, and he held up a piece of paper. "The drought has been declared an emergency. The county has empowered me to drill wells wherever they are needed. This land is part of the settlement, and the water is a common resource." The contract was not a deed. The land was Elena's, but the county had authority in an emergency. She could fight it, but the fight would take weeks, and the well would be finished long before she could get a court order. She looked at the well digger, who was avoiding her eyes, and she understood that Hargrove had planned this carefully. He had found a legal way to take control of the water on her land. The well was not about water. It was about breaking her. She turned and walked back to the house, her hands shaking. She sat at the table and stared at the wall, and she felt the old hopelessness rising again. The flock needed water, the share system needed the flock, and now the water that sustained them would be controlled by the man who wanted to destroy them. The well was finished in 3 days. It was a deep well, and it produced clean, abundant water. Hargrove installed a hand pump and announced that the water would be sold at a fair price to all who needed it. The fair price was exactly what he had been charging before, $1 a barrel. The 19 families who had signed the contract could not afford that. They had been relying on the spring, which had not yet frozen, but the spring was 2 miles away, and carrying water through the winter snow would break them. Elena stood at the window on the 4th morning, watching the families arriving at Hargrove's well with their buckets, their faces set in lines of resignation. They paid his price because they had no choice. The share system had thinned the burden, but it could not carry the weight of a water bill. The flock could not survive without water. The eggs would dwindle, the birds would sicken, and the contract would collapse. She was in the coop that evening, feeding the hens by lamplight, when Sam found her. He carried a small jar in his hands, and he held it out to her without a word. The jar was filled with water, clear and cold. Elena looked at him and saw that he was grinning. "How did you get this?" "Hargrove's well has a leak," Sam said, "a small one. The pipe that runs from the pump to the trough has a crack in it. I found it this morning. It drips into the dirt, and nobody has noticed." I put the jar under it, and it took an hour to fill, but it fills." Elena stared at the jar, and for a moment she did not know whether to laugh or cry. A crack in a pipe, a slow drip, a boy with a jar and the patience to wait. It was not a solution. It could not water 42 birds, but it was something, a small defiance, a crack of light in the darkness. "Sam," she said, "you are a wonder." The leak became their secret. Sam collected the water every evening, a few quarts at a time, and he used it to water the youngest chicks, the ones that needed the most care. It was not enough to save the flock, but it was enough to keep the smallest birds alive, and that felt like a victory. But the winter deepened, and the spring began to run low, and Hargrove's prices remained. The 19 families grew thinner and more desperate. The eggs from the monstrous hens were not enough to buy the water they needed. The share system was fraying, not from betrayal, but from the simple, grinding weight of arithmetic. Elena walked to Hargrove's farm on the last day of the year. She stood at his gate, and he came out to meet her, his breath fogging in the cold. He had the look of a man who had won, and he did not try to hide it. "I'm prepared to make you an offer," he said. "I will buy the entire flock at a fair price, and I will provide water from my well to the settlement for free for the rest of the winter. Your contract families will get their water for nothing. All you have to do is sign the deed and walk away." Elena looked at him. She thought of the contract, the 19 families, the eggs that had kept them alive. She thought of Sam, and the jar, and the slow drip. She thought of her grandmother, and the words that had carried her through every trial. "No," she said. Hargrove's smile did not waver. "You'll change your mind. They always do." Elena turned and walked back to the farm. The snow was falling now, soft and steady, covering the tracks of her boots before she had taken 20 steps. The flock was quiet in the coop, the lamp was burning in the window, and the crack in Hargrove's well was still dripping, slow and steady, the only water that was free in the whole settlement. She went into the house and sat down at the table, and she began to write a new letter to the county, asking for an inspection of the well, asking for a ruling on the water rights. It was a long shot, and she knew it. But she had learned that every battle was fought one step at a time, and she was not finished. The year turned, the snow fell deeper. The spring froze solid for the first week of January, and the families who had been hauling from the spring found themselves with nothing but Hargrove's well. The share system held, but barely. Elena used her last pennies to buy a barrel of water, and she rationed it to the birds and to herself, and she waited for a reply from the county that did not come. And then, on the 10th day of January, when the cold had settled into a death grip and the last of the feed was running out, the knock came at her door. It was not dawn, not yet. The sky was dark and the wind was howling. Elena opened the door to find Pruitt standing on her porch, a lantern in his hand, his face hard and urgent. "Miss Cross," he said, "something has happened. Hargrove's well has collapsed." Elena stared at him. "Collapsed?" "The walls caved in during the night. The pipe broke. The water is gone." He paused. "And his cattle are dying. He has no water left to sell. He is at the church right now asking for help. The settlement has gathered." Elena stood in the doorway, the cold air swirling around her, and she felt something strange stirring in her chest. It was not triumph, it was not anger. It was a slow, deep certainty. The same certainty she had felt the day she had bought the monstrous birds, the day she had hauled water for the Lawrence cousins, the day she had written the contract. Hargrove had built his power on the well, and now the well was gone. She put on her coat and walked through the dark to the church, the snow crunching under her boots. The lights were on inside, and the murmur of voices was urgent, frightened. She pushed open the door, and every head turned. Hargrove was standing at the front, his face gray, his clothes rumpled. He looked like a man who had lost everything in a single night, and in a way he had. "Miss Cross," he said, and his voice cracked, "I have no water. My cattle are dying. The families who paid me have nothing. I cannot help them." Elena looked at him, and she did not gloat. She did not remind him of the auction, the inspector, the petition, the rumors. She simply looked at him, and she spoke the words that had been forming in her heart since the night of the storm. "There is a spring 2 miles north," she said. "It is low, but it is still flowing. If the settlement works together, we can carry enough water to keep the stock alive until the thaw. The monstrous hens are still laying. The flock can feed us. But we have to work together, all of us." Hargrove stared at her. The room was silent. And then, slowly, he nodded. "I don't deserve your help," he said. "No," Elena said. "But the settlement needs you, the cattle need you, and the monstrous hens need everyone." The winter broke in February, and the spring that followed was the wettest in memory. The creek rose, the wells filled, and the fields greened. The monstrous hens, which had survived on the water hauled from the spring and the leak that had never stopped dripping, began to lay again in earnest. The flock grew to 70 birds, then to 90, and the share system, rebuilt on the foundation of the contract and the trust that had been forged in the hardest months, held strong. Hargrove, humbled and quiet, signed the contract in March. He brought a donation of lumber for the new coop. He did not say much, but he showed up, and the settlement accepted him, not because he deserved it, but because survival required forgiveness. Elena stood on her porch one April morning, watching the sun rise over the green fields, the monstrous hens scratching in the yard, a new clutch of chicks trailing behind Goliath. Sam was at the corner of the coop, scattering feed, his voice carrying in the soft air. She thought of her grandmother, and she smiled. "A thing's worth shows only in what it does," she whispered. And the great hens murmured in reply, patient and faithful, the living proof of all that had been shown. The spring of that year arrived not as a gentle thaw, but as a sudden breaking, as if the earth had held its breath through the long winter and now exhaled all at once. The creek rose overnight, the ice cracking and groaning before giving way to a rush of brown water that spilled over the banks and soaked the parched ground. By the second week of March, the first green shoots appeared in the fields, tentative at first, then bold, spreading across the land like a promise kept. Elena Cross stood at the kitchen window on a morning when the sun had real warmth in it for the first time in months, and she watched the monstrous hens scratching in the yard, their feathers gleaming, their steps quick and purposeful. The flock had grown to 94 birds over the winter, and the coop that had been rebuilt after the storm was now a network of 3 connected shelters, each one filled with the soft clucking and rustling of contented fowl. The share system had held. 19 families had become 23, and then 27. And now, as the snow melted and the roads dried, families who had stayed away for months were returning to sign the contract, their pride softened by the long hunger and the hard lesson of the winter. Elena did not turn them away. She welcomed each one, wrote their names in the ledger, and showed them how to scatter feed and gather eggs. The bitter part of her, the part that remembered the laughter and the whispers, had been worn down by the winter into something quieter and deeper. Not forgiveness exactly, but an understanding that holding a grudge was a burden she could no longer carry. The day of the spring planting festival arrived in early April, a tradition that had lapsed during the drought but was revived this year with a fervor that surprised even the oldest settlers. The church was decorated with wildflowers, and long tables were set up in the yard, laden with dishes that the families had scraped together from their meager stores. There was a roasted goat from the Pettigrew's farm, a pot of beans from the widow Dunmore, and a great mound of cornbread that Mrs. Gardner had baked with the last of her flour. And there were eggs, of course, a mountain of them, boiled and pickled and fried and baked into custards, the great speckled eggs that had become the symbol of the settlement's survival. Elena had been asked to speak, and she had spent the night before staring at the ceiling, trying to find words that would match the size of what had happened. She stood at the front of the crowd as the sun climbed toward noon, smoothing her apron with hands that had not stopped trembling since she woke. The faces before her were different from the ones that had laughed at the auction. They were the faces of people who had carried water together, who had shared the last of their flour, who had learned to trust one another because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. She saw Sam in the front row, his hair sticking up, Lady Wednesday perched on his shoulder as if she were a tame parrot. She saw Mrs. Gardner, her eyes bright and wet. She saw the Lawrence cousins, the schoolteacher, the widow Dunmore, and dozens of others whose names she had written in the ledger. And in the back, standing alone, hat in hand, she saw Hargrove. He had aged in the months since the well collapsed. The smooth confidence that had carried him through a decade of buying up failed farms had been replaced by something quieter, a humility that had been forced upon him by the collapse of his own schemes. He had signed the contract in March, and he had shown up every day since, bringing lumber and feed and labor, saying little, working hard. Elena had not spoken to him alone since the night of the well collapse. She had not avoided him, but she had not sought him out either. She was waiting, she realized now, for something to be finished. "The year that has passed," Elena began, and her voice was thin at first, caught in her throat. She paused, took a breath, and began again. "The year that has passed has been the hardest I have ever known. It has been hard for all of us. We lost our crops. We lost our wells. We lost neighbors who moved away because they could not bear the hunger. But we are still here. And the reason we are still here is not because of me. It is because of these birds." She gestured toward the coop, where the monstrous hens were visible through the open door, their heads turning, their small, calm eyes watching the crowd with the patience of creatures that had never doubted themselves. "When I bought them at the auction, everyone laughed, and they were right to laugh in a way. It was a foolish thing to do, to spend my last dollar on birds that nobody wanted. But my grandmother told me something before she died. She told me that folks judge a thing by its covering, but a thing's worth shows only in what it does. I did not know what the birds could do when I bought them. I only knew that I had to find out." She paused again, and the silence held. "The birds fed us through the grasshoppers. The birds fed us through the drought. The birds fed us through the winter when the wells ran dry. And they are still feeding us. They will keep feeding us as long as we take care of them, and as long as we take care of each other." She looked out at the crowd, and she saw that some of them were crying. She felt the tears on her own cheeks, cool in the spring air. "So I want to say thank you. To the families who signed the contract and kept the faith. To the ones who hauled water and mended fences and believed that we could do this together. And to the ones who doubted, because doubting is part of believing. We all have to learn. I learned, and I am still learning." She stepped back from the table, and the crowd applauded. It was not the loud applause of a celebration. It was the quieter sound of people who had been through something together and had come out the other side. Elena felt her knees go weak with relief, and she leaned against the table, letting the moment wash over her. The festival continued through the afternoon. There was music from a fiddle and a squeeze box, and the children played games in the pasture. The monstrous hens, accustomed to the commotion, wandered freely among the tables, pecking at fallen crumbs, and the youngest children chased them with delighted squeals. Elena sat on a bench near the church wall, watching, her hands wrapped around a cup of cold tea, and then Hargrove was standing in front of her. He did not look like the man who had stood at the auction, laughing at her birds. He did not look like the man who had filed the complaint with the inspector, or organized the petition, or drilled the well on her land without permission. He looked older and smaller and tired in a way that went deeper than his body. "Miss Cross," he said. His voice was rough, as if he had not used it in a while. "I have something to say." Elena waited. "I was wrong about you." The words hung in the air, simple and enormous. He said them without flourishes, without excuses, without any attempt to soften the admission. He looked at the ground, and then he looked at her, and his eyes were wet. "I was wrong about you," he repeated. "I was wrong about the birds. I was wrong about everything. I thought I knew what a farm looked like, and what a woman could do, and what was worth something and what was not. I was wrong. And this winter, when my well collapsed and my cattle were dying, and you offered to help, I realized that I had spent a year trying to destroy the only person in this settlement who could have saved it." He took a breath, and his voice shook. "I do not expect you to forgive me. I do not expect you to trust me. But I want you to know that I see it now. I see what the birds can do. I see what you can do. And I am ashamed of what I did." Elena looked at him, and she felt the weight of the year settling between them. The inspector, the petition, the water, the rumors, the long, grinding campaign of whispers that had nearly broken her. She could have let him stand there in silence. She could have walked away. but she remembered what her grandmother had said about looking at what a thing does, and she looked at what Hargrove was doing now. He was standing before her, in front of the whole settlement, admitting that he had been wrong. That was a thing of worth. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, "I will not pretend that I have forgotten what you did, but I have learned that holding a grudge is heavier than hauling water, and I would rather haul water." He did not smile. He simply nodded, and something in his shoulders loosened, as if a knot had been cut. He turned and walked away, and Elena watched him go, and she felt a door closing behind her that she had not even known was open. The celebration continued into the evening. The lanterns were lit, and the music grew louder, and the children fell asleep in their mothers' laps. Elena slipped away as the stars began to appear, walking home along the road that was now firm and dry, the fields on either side showing the faint green of sprouting wheat. She reached the farm and stopped at the gate, looking at the coop where the monstrous hens were settling for the night. The door was open, and she could see them inside, a shifting mass of feathers and soft sounds. She walked in and sat down on the straw. The hens murmured and moved to make room for her. Goliath, the great crowned rooster, came over and stood beside her, his comb bright in the dim light. She reached out and touched his feathers, and he made a low, contented sound. She thought of her grandmother. The old woman had not lived to see what the monstrous hens could do. She had not lived to see the contract, the share system, the winter that had been survived, the spring that had brought redemption. But she had left the words, and the words had carried Elena through every trial. A thing's worth shows only in what it does. Elena took a deep breath, the air warm with the smell of straw and chickens and the good earth. She reached into the nest beside her, where a single egg lay, still warm from the hen that had laid it. It was the first egg of the new season, large and speckled, perfect in her palm. She held it up to the light that filtered through the cracks in the coop, and she saw the shape of it, the weight of it, the promise of it. She had come here with nothing but a grandmother's words and $11. She had bought a flock of monsters and endured the laughter. She had fought the drought and the rumors and the greed of a powerful man. And she had won, not by being stronger, but by being patient enough to let the worth of things show themselves. She closed her hand around the egg and stood up. The hens murmured their good night. She walked into the house and set the egg on the windowsill, where the morning light would find it. Then she sat down at the table, opened the ledger, and began to write the numbers for the next day. This is Elias Vance, and you have been listening to Frontier Secrets. Subscribe and step back in time. The frontier hides more than it shows.